Chapter 2. Drive. These days, I'd do anything to get into that old Silver. Just take her out and drive along my asphalt memories and dreams. As the door slammed, a woman's voice, a computer spoke. Adjusting seat and cabin temperature, it said. Matt laughed at the sound. He knew that the temperature control didn't work. It didn't even work when he bought the car 4 years ago. It was an old 31 Honda Silver. The color actually was silver. It was a sporty car, yet not impractical. Stephanie was there when he picked it out. She told him that he would look sexy in a car like this. It was that very comment that sold him on the car. To his right, an empty passenger seat. A notebook shoved down in the crevice, where the back and the seat met. Matt would doodle and write in this particular notebook when his college classes seemed boring. He remembered that she was the last person to ride in that seat. The smell was musty from the years of the car sitting empty throughout the seasons. The windshield was spackled with dry raindrops and other buildup that accumulated. It had been 3 years since he had been in this car. With the turn of the key, the car made a painful sounding turnover. It started, but with a tremor that echoed throughout the car. I had better let the oil circulate through the engine before we take off, Matt thought to himself. But maybe he wasn't alone. Maybe he was with the very real memory of his Stephanie. As the shutter evened out, Matt pulled out his old audio player, connected it. The sounds of the music acted as a magnifying glass to his emotions. When he looked over to the passenger seat, now he actually saw her with the help of the music. The memory was here. She was sitting in the car as the sun was gleaming down on her, beaming through the passenger window. Her dark features were highlighted. She was explaining her day at work to him. Work was that old diner on Straight Street. The content of what she would say wasn't of much importance to him. The topic was always the gossip of the other girls at the diner. He loved to hear her stories, though. Sometimes it annoyed him, of course. He would just block out the words that she was saying and admire her beauty, smiling. She was never looking for a response from him. Not when she would empty her head to him like this. She just needed him to listen. And listen, he did. Every night when he would pick her up from work. She never did get a car. Not while Matt knew her. Those were great days, Matt thought. Those slow days didn't seem to have much of a significance at the time. Yet, the time they spent simply sharing their lives became the foundation to a very strong bond. He now realized this. During much of the past 6 months, his thoughts could be found in the recollection of those slow, seemingly meaningless days. To him, they were the glory days of their time together. Letting the memory subside, he put the car in reverse and pulled out onto the street. The first stop sign was at Honeycomb and Lion's Den. He stopped, breathing in the moment. This moment, his official arrival home. At Main Street, he turned right instead of left, out into the country. The back road served as an altar of contemplation when he was young. He would drive and think things out. He would ruminate on problems between Stephanie and him, money issues, and most importantly to him, the future. Originally, he was going to school for business. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do, but with a degree in business, the options were plentiful. Matt started college right after high school. The classes were hard. He didn't know if he liked them. He worked a lot at an electronics retail store. Stephanie was also keeping him busy, busiest of all. Their relationship had become very hot and cold. She was either on his back about how he pressures her with the relationship, or calling him at all hours of the night with nightmares that he was leaving her. She would cling to him relentlessly for the next few days. He would do his best to calm her down just by being calm himself. "Steph," he said in a half-whisper, "I'm never going to leave you." Then, he would give her a reassuring, gentle smile. He tried his best to be consistent in his response. After all, she'd become a very beautiful young woman. Very thin and athletic, with long brunette hair, dark, soft skin, and bottomless brown eyes. She was beautiful. She was stunning. She would wear her hair up in a ponytail. Matt loved it. Simple, yet gorgeous. He could see her whole face. When Matt told Stephanie's mother about what her father had done, she confronted Stephanie about it. Stephanie told her the truth. Problems and fighting increased between Stephanie's parents. After trying to live separately for a year, they divorced. There was never any talk about prosecution or anything of that nature. Matt battled with not pushing for it. He always decided against it for Stephanie's sake. Stephanie put so much blame on herself for the split of her family, Matt thought. I couldn't do that to her, no matter how much I want justice. Stephanie had increasingly taken part in self-destructive habits. She became bulimic, binging and purging. She had many drug binges that she tried to hide from Matt. They were all among the ways she would try to deal with her pain. Her friend Amanda had a lot to do with this. The conversation that Matt overheard the day he asked Stephanie out in the hallway was their first drug buy. Matt found this out later. It was only marijuana. A lot of kids in school, even Matt, did marijuana once or twice. He never thought much of it. It was like a little kid's drug. You would eventually grow out of it, Matt used to think. But after high school, Stephanie's habit increased and moved on to other more serious drugs. Matt's place in Stephanie's life had become provider and the shoulder to cry on. He was there when her destructive tendencies tore down the world around her. He often felt helpless in this situation. He just hoped it would get better on its own. But it got to the point where he had to do something. On the anniversary of the day Matt first asked her out, Matt always remembered dates well, he planned on surprising Stephanie. He planned on calling off work that day, not going to any of his college classes. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. Matt slept in a little. He packed a picnic lunch and washed his car. The same car we rode in on that first date, he thought. He was planning on taking Stephanie out to a secluded area of the park to have a romantic afternoon lunch. In Matt's mind, this was something huge to celebrate. 3 years since the day I asked her out in the hallway. He was so excited to see her face when he surprised her. She would expect him to be at his marketing class as he arrived at her house. When he arrived, he ran to the door with a flower he had handpicked. 1 rose, to be exact, white. It was Stephanie's favorite color, the color of purity. "Watch your speed, Mr. Blair," the computer voice interrupted his memory. Matt headed towards Stephanie's house, out in the country. Now, he was not only arriving in his memory, but also in reality. The house sat at the back of Driftwood Circle. This was where he and Steph grew up. He pulled into the circle, returning to the theater of his mind. With the slam of his door, flower in hand, Matt ran to the front door. He knocked. Mrs. Morris answered. "Hi, Matt," she said, opening the door to him. "How are you?" Matt didn't enter. It was not exactly what his vision had revealed about the day. He just wouldn't have it any other way. He wanted Stephanie to come to the door. Then, he would take her hand, and they would run to his car, like a couple of small children playing. He was such a romantic. That was the vision. And he wanted that haloed, childlike feeling to be present the whole day. "Is Steph home?" he asked. She gave him sort of a curious look when he did not come in. "No?" She returned to the arch of the doorway. "She never came home last night. She was out with Amanda. I don't know when she plans on coming home. You can come in and wait. I expect her sometime soon." The perfect vision Matt had had of this day suddenly shattered. Matt was flexible, though, and he tried to understand. Okay, he muttered, trying to get his emotions under rein. "I've been waiting for exactly 1 hour and 23 minutes, Matt thought after a while. He sat, brooding in the living room. "Do you know where Amanda lives?" he asked Steph's mother, who was busy in the kitchen. "She lives on the edge of town, I think over on Fuller," she shouted back over the sound of a mixer or some other kitchen device. "Okay, I'm going to go see if I can find it." "Okay, sweetie. If she comes home, I'll have her call you." "Thanks," Matt said, almost exactly in time with the door slamming. He was gone, and not too happy by this point. He drove up and down Fuller Street, trying to remember what color Amanda's car was. He knew he would eventually be able to identify it. He never paid much attention to Amanda. He didn't like her. There was a bad feeling he just couldn't ignore every time she was around. He could even remember feeling the feeling as she walked up to him that first time, long ago, in the hallway. A blue Ford caught his attention at the corner of the street. He knew he had seen it before. The car was parked in a duplex, with the yard somewhat unkempt, a baby blue color. The house was run down, with white blotches in the paint on the front and the sides. It looked like the result of bleach being thrown on the house. Matt pulled up behind the car in the one-lane driveway. Hesitantly, he shut the car door. As he walked by the blue Ford, he recognized the air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. The logo on it, a band the girls discussed often, Carnivore. Now, Matt knew he was at the right place. He moved towards the door, a renewed sense of purpose. He knocked. No answer for the first few. Then, a pair of eyes peered through the blinds of the inner door. It opened, and through the outer screen door, a lengthy, shirtless male, about 20, answered. He had a sneer, and he didn't say a word. Matt met his glare. "Is Stephanie here?" Matt asked. Matt's reason for being here had nothing to do with this guy. He hoped it stayed that way. "Yeah," he said, after a short pause. She's upstairs." This guy was losing the staring match anyway. He resigned, sat on the couch, and resumed watching the television. He didn't hold the door, just left it open. Matt looked at him for a second and paused. He looked back at him, spoke. "She's in Amanda's room. Top of the steps, second door on the right." The man continued to stare at Matt as he ascended into the upper level of the house. Matt focused on finding Steph. He eyed the second door on the right of the hallway. Paused, all of a sudden fearful of what he might find. Would she be in that room with another guy? Would she be passed out from the binge the night before? Some kind of drug binge? Matt suddenly witnessed himself almost running for the door, escaping the racing thoughts. He grasped the handle tightly in his hand, and at the same second, he turned. It was locked. He knocked. "Stephanie," he gave a soft yell. "Stephanie, are you in there?" He continued to nervously rattle the handle. Unexpectedly, without the force of his hand, it turned and opened, but only enough to see a pair of infamous eyes. "What are you doing?" said a snotty young woman. It was Amanda. "Where is she?" "She's sleeping." Amanda held the door open, only enough to peek through the doorway. It was obvious they were hiding something. "Amanda, open the damn door," he shouted more loudly this time. There was a rustle within the room. Amanda turned around. The door went flying open. It was Steph. "What the fuck is your problem, Matt? What are you doing here?" Steph shouted. There was a long pause. Matt could see behind her empty liquor bottles, and on the desk, a white powdery substance, cocaine. She turned her head, seeing what Matt was seeing. She turned back to him. There was anger burning from deep in her brown eyes. Matt felt betrayed, like he did not even know this young woman he cherished so much. "What is going on, Steph?" he asked, a tremble in his voice. "You answer me first," she shouted. Anger shot through Matt. She betrayed him, and now was yelling at him. How did that make any sense? And all on a day they were to celebrate. Amanda watched on the sideline, helpless, like a victim watches a hurricane rip the roof off their house. Matt punched the wall. His fist went crashing through the drywall, knocking a mirror to the floor. A bloody scream erupted from Matt's throat, tearing. "Do you know what today is? I took off work and school to be with you, and all you can do is fuck yourself up." He could taste iron on the back of his throat. Blood. She said nothing. "This is bullshit, Steph. You don't have to deal with this," Amanda finally argued. "Get out," Matt screamed. She tried to answer. "Get out," Matt said calmly, as he stared at her with a calm insanity. Amanda left the room, and no sooner a voice came from the hallway. "Hey, man, do you got something to prove here?" It was the guy from the living room. He stepped into the room, his fists clenched. Letting Kyle's words sink in, feeling his anger, Matt let a brief second pass. Then, Matt shoved his opponent to the ground, slammed the door, and turned toward Stephanie. It all appeared to her as one graceful movement. The look on her face was that of confusion and anger. Then, into a contorted, full-face frown. "What's going on here, Steph?" Matt continued. "Why, he, she said, as she began a harsh, helpless cry. He walked over to the table with the cocaine on it. "What is this?" "What do you think it is?" she cried. "Why, Steph?" he sincerely added. There was no reply. She just broke down, face down, on the bed. Matt sat on the bed next to her and looked out the window. A car passed. There was a couple of older ladies walking down the street together. It all seemed like slow motion. Normal life existed out there in this moment, but it did not in this room. And none of it could compete with the speed of Matt's beating heart. Slowly, he turned his head towards her and felt a tear stream down his cheek. He could hear her sobbing. He positioned his body so he could reach her. He ran his fingers through her hair, staring out the window at the peace the blue and white seemed to bring. What can I do? He thought. What can I do? He lifted her up and carried her out of the house. She was exhausted. Kyle and Amanda stood in silence as he walked, Stephanie in arms. When they returned to Stephanie's house, they played it off as if nothing had happened. Matt didn't bring it up for the rest of the day. She got cleaned up and they went to the park. He thought about bringing it up, but she seemed to forget the whole thing already, so he didn't. He did his best to ignore the events, but there remained a stigma that stained the day. It didn't seem to be on Steph's mind at all. It was like she had forgotten. The next day, they talked about it. Matt told her that he wanted her to go to an outpatient drug rehab center. They would make it so that her mother wouldn't find out. As time passed, Stephanie seemed to be making progress. Her mood had changed. She had a positive outlook on things. She seemed to be happy. Again. Matt had not seen or heard her talk about Amanda for a long time. Maybe she realized that Amanda was part of the problem. Stephanie's mother was going to lose the house, so he pushed her to get her own place. He would help with the rent and keeping it up. Within 6 months of rehab, life seemed to be getting back to the golden days they once had shared. Matt was approaching 20 at this point. He was working on his degree. He wasn't sure if he really enjoyed it, but it worked. His father was a manager at a local plant. Matt always admired him. He was always thinking about what was best for his family. He was constantly on the phone at home, working on getting companies to bring new business. Matt had no doubt in his mind that his dad was the best. He had built a simple life, not scattered. Matt and his family were content. They were safe. His mother and father would often laugh together. That's what Matt wanted for him and Steph, just to be open and laugh at the end of the day. Matt's sister Amy had always known she wanted to be a nurse, and he envied that. He didn't know where he fit in with the world. And as he was about to enter his 20s, there was pressure about making his future happen. While eating lunch one day at the college cafeteria, Matt saw the World Police Force was recruiting. They had come and set up a table and were handing out pamphlets. He had never even known anyone that had been in the service. For some reason, now, he was curious. Something about it appealed to him. Maybe, he thought, it would give me time to get away from this life and make some decisions about who I really am. Matt so badly wanted that time. These days, he had no time. He was working, going to school, and taking care of Stephanie and her nightmares. Matt walked over to the table when he noticed the man in the uniform was preoccupied with another student. He grabbed a couple of pamphlets. He read them, and his interest grew. He was always a very pacific person, though. The thought of joining had never seemed like a possibility to him until now. He rolled the idea around for several days. He didn't abandon it, but filed it in his mind for later use. "Low on fuel, Mr. Blair," the car spoke. Matt was startled by the sound. He looked around, remembering where he was. He was still sitting, staring at Stephanie's old house. He put the car in drive and circled around, leaving it behind. In silence, he headed towards the gas station. He reached in his pocket for some money he had stuffed there, just in case. 7778 filled up the tank, and he walked inside to pay. There was an old man sitting at the counter. "What are you doing out so late?" the man asked. "Oh, I'm just out for a drive," he said, without making eye contact with him, focusing on counting the change he had in his pocket. 7778, the man said. Matt let out a sigh. "I don't have enough. Could I leave my license and come back and pay?" "How much you got there?" asked the man. $55.30, responded Matt. "Don't worry about it, son. I have the rest." Matt's eyes rose to the man. He hadn't been around another human being besides his family for months. He studied him. He was all gray-haired, wrinkled, and probably about 75 years old. He had an ashtray next to him, with a pipe next to that, and a book. Matt couldn't make out the title. "Oh, sir, you don't have to do that," Matt stuttered. "Son, one of the lessons you're going to have to learn is it's okay to accept help. If you give, you're helping someone. If you let someone give, you're helping them by giving them the chance to give. There really is no way to lose. By giving to you, well, I hope you just pay it forward," the man said, and smiled. The attendant's words were simple, yet profound. Matt admired the man's karmic belief. He didn't realize that his first interaction with another human being would have this much of an impact on him. Matt smiled and said thanks. "Don't worry about it," he replied. "Speaking of son, looks like you need to get some." "I'll do that," Matt laughed. The attendant smiled and gave a wave as Matt walked out the door. "Adjusting seat and cabin temperature," said the car. Matt laughed to himself. The man in the store seemed to have things figured out. Matt envied that. "I guess it comes with age," he thought. It seemed the old man in the store had found some sort of peace. It was the same sort of peace that Matt was seeking. The old man was content to where his life had led him. He accepted it, he learned from it, then passed it on to others. There was a beauty in this. Matt thought far into the future. When he was that age, he pictured himself retired. He could see himself working the midnight shift at a gas station, to pass the time, to interact with others. He'd pass on the lessons he learned on his journey through life. Even at 23 years old, Matt felt he had been through a lot. Definitely not as much as that old man had been through, he thought. He probably has stories I can't compete with. Matt knew he had one story the old man may be hard put to compete with. The story he was recovering from. The story where the only real action he had seen in the military almost killed him. The details were evasive. Matt was stationed in Chaco, Argentina, near the Paraguay border. He had a year deployed there. The day in question started as any other day. Routine post shifts, scouting squads, and the warm Argentinian weather was all he could remember of those days. The monotonous routines of WPF life were effective, yet boring. This was due to the fact that there was little action. That would soon change. In 2032, the President of the United States declared a mandate naming the U.S. as the police force of the world. This was a prevention method against the rallying of terrorism throughout the turbulent parts of the world. Much of this terrorism was becoming aimed at the U.S. and its never-ending grab for power, or at least This is how some perceived it. However, it also had its upsides. The World Police Force acted as a missionary for the doctrines of democracy and freedom. It sought to influence governmental regimes in a humanitarian direction and end starvation and poverty in all the world. The WPF helped develop economic processes and enforced laws in almost all other countries. The U.S. Armed Forces joined with the United Nations, and from then on was known as the World Police Force, the WPF. Inside the U.S., this caused two positions on the issue: extreme support or extreme opposition. On one hand, some felt that the U.S. should not be involved with other countries in this manner, but the argument weakened as a string of successful terrorist attacks were planned and successfully carried out across the world, aimed at the U.S. The argument that was the current winner was that this World Police Force would be able to seek out and shut down terrorist organizations. They could have a presence across the world before there could be any further terrorist threat upon the U.S. This was unlike anything ever done in the realms of history. The media called this the Utopian Revolution, the title taken from President Jameson's favorite speech, in which he said, "With the World Police Force fighting to enforce the values that we exude in our nation, we push one step more towards a world utopia." President Jameson was a military genius. He excelled in passionate public speaking, famous for his hunting of terrorist groups all over the world. A Marine himself, many of the WPF practices mirrored and were designed after Marine code. Jameson was responsible for the capture, and in many cases, the death of Osama bin Laden's disciples. These retro factions carried on bin Laden's tradition of wrath towards and attack on America. Jameson's legendary Silver Eagle Task Force, full of skilled Green Beret, had become household legends in most of the world. The fiery speeches he gave at press conferences, called after each successful mission, did a lot to promote the Eagle. With the help of the press, he was the leader of a renewed sense of nationalism and patriotism in the United States of America. The tide had turned. A conservative point of view was now seen as moderate, liberal points of view seen as far left. Jameson was quick to decide to run for president after his group had all but destroyed the threat of terrorism in the world. This was a time in the nation's history when militarism was viewed favorably for the protection and preservation of the country. He was elected in 2032 by a landslide. He owned the media streams of the time, and the liberal press could do nothing to stop the momentum. This was an unprecedented shift to the right for the country. He was the youngest president in history, being elected at 37 years old. It seemed he had more power over his people than any other president as well. He could sway public opinion with his powerful public speaking ability. His opposition argued he was reminiscent of Adolf Hitler after World War I. Those who opposed him didn't seem to be around for long. There were allegations that China's sudden willingness to cooperate had to do with secret military operations to take out key members of the Chinese government. China would never admit this in an effort at avoiding embarrassment. Nothing stuck. Things never seemed to be better inside the American borders, yet opposition voices seemed to silence themselves. The arguments that Jameson played on citizens' fears, allowing him to secure more control over governmental processes, were made to seem cartoonish. The accusation, not too popular, due to the growing confidence in Americanism throughout the world. Or perhaps they were just more fearful of the wrath of America than ever. The economy was thriving. Many people felt safer and happier with the state of the country than they had in generations. It was a popular sentiment And so, it was hard to argue that the president was wrong. One thing the opposition had to admit, Jameson hadn't made any mistakes. Not yet. They would be closely watching, throwing anything at the wall that would stick. But nothing would stick to Jameson, at least not during his presidency. Matt was unsure about how he felt about the world police force and Jameson. He was never one for politics. He had a mind made for art. He loved his country and did what he could to be of service. His choice to join the WPF was a choice made on the facts of his personal situation. He saw no need to embark on crusades of a global magnitude. He just needed a way out of his life. The WPF was that ticket. Matt reached with his memory to find the events that led him to this drive. A drive that would go down in the history book of his mind as the drive, he thought. The WPF generally functioned as military police in some regions. The force was accepted in Argentina by the efforts of President Jameson's missionary-like tour to several countries. This included Argentina. During the tour, he sold the future efforts of the U.S.'s World Police Force. But he spoke not only to the leaders of the country, but also to the people themselves. The message was received with much fanfare. On one hot February morning, Matt was on a scouting squad. The squad was scouting out some of the uninhabited lands, investigating a rumor. The rumor surfaced in the undercurrents of the Argentinian streets of a large drug operation. The rumor was that it operated in the wild jungle-like regions of the country. Oftentimes, soybean farms doubled as drug farms, the soybeans only for show. This was a case of local enforcement with some international implications. But busts like these happen all the time, all over the world. The WPF was always on the trail of these operations. This was a break from his routine policing of the outer-lying villages. As they were deeper and deeper into the jungle, the squad was radioed. The intel said that there was an opening sighted in what appeared to be a hillside. There was suspicion, due to a satellite image, that it was more than what it looked. Matt, although curious to why there was a break in his everyday routine, welcomed the change. The squad commander led them into dangerous territory. 19 privates and 1 squad commander assigned to the scouting platoon. Matt was serving as private first class. The squad commander grouped them in a huddle as they approached the suspected hillside. He spoke to the squad. Okay, there is suspicion of the existence of some sort of an illegal drug operation. This could be the big one. The operation getting heroin through the Canadian border. We move in, check it out, and if we find anything, we keep the rights of the citizens in check until there's evidence of criminal activities. At that time, we'll issue arrests where arrests need be. Got it? There were agreeing grunts throughout the company. They moved on. Peterson and Camp divided the squad into 2 flanks. Blair, Frank, Salo, you're going direct with me. If there is no communication from us within 7 minutes, starting when we go in, move the flanks in, said the commander. The squad moved as instructed. This was going to go down like a bust. That was evident. Matt knew he was going in with the commander. Nervous, he felt his hands growing clammy. There was a bead of sweat rolling down his forehead in the heat. The whole squad dressed the same. Camouflage pants and shirts, and the letters US, WPF embroidered on their backs and down their green helmets. Matt had not known any action, nor faced any fire up to this point in the military. Though well-trained, he was nervous. He did not let it outwardly show a break in his confidence. This ability gave him an elite exterior. This is probably why the commander chose Matt to go with him. He remained focused on the task. His mind was tuned to his duty. He was ready to get the job done. The direct group moved in with the left flank. The hillside was in the open, except for a few low-hanging tree branches at its base. It looked suspicious for a variety of reasons, and this awkward arrangement of trees around the hillside. There was a discoloration on the hillside. 2.5 feet from the ground, it was a deeper green than the rest of the green grass that covered the hillside. Because of the dark colors and the trees, the discoloration was undetectable from 50 yards away. But now, the squad moved in. It became more and more obvious. The commander spoke over the radio in code. 52395. It looks like she's going out tonight, so we're headed out for a drink, said Salter. Matt was surprised at the sudden change in the commander's voice. He sounded like he was just giving out some friendly radio chatter. It wasn't too slick, Matt thought, but it seemed to work. A voice responded on the other end. 50199. It was a terrible fake laugh. We'll see you out there. Over. Matt gave Frank a ridiculous look at the code they were using. The higher-ups were known for being non-urgent over the radio. This was supposed to throw off the enemy? They were using the lazy American stereotype to their advantage. Commander Salter gave the crew a sign to break off. They moved in towards the far side of the hill, closer to the discoloration. The direct group left their weapons at their sides. The flanks had them pulled, ready to move in at any side of trouble. Once the direct group went in, the flanks were to pull up to either side of the entrance and stand by. The commander fell back when they reached the discolored entrance. He looked at Frank, giving him a nod to open the door. Frank opened it, using a metal handle sticking out of the discolored grass. Like a safe at a bank, a hatch opened out of the ground, revealing a man-made structure beneath. They entered information, their TX model automated rifles in hand. There was no one immediately inside, just a long tunnel-like hallway. Looking left and right, the tunnel seemed endless. They went in. The commander was last. He closed the door, gently, without making a sound. Commander Salter moved them down the endless tunnel. As they approached the end of the tunnel, the commander took the lead. They began to hear voices. The language was not Argentinian. It was not English. Matt thought it was of Middle East origin. There was no way he could be sure. The voices were coming from the west side of the tunnel's crossroads. The commander moved to the edge of the corner with his back against the wall. The voices did not seem to be hostile, but the commander took aggressive action anyway. He darted around the corner, finding himself in a room that looked like a doctor's office waiting room. There were 3 men. 2 men conversing with arms crossed, and the other seated, not looking. They followed the commander from around the corner, taking their positions. "Freeze," Salter said firmly. He calmly rounded the corner, his weapon pointed at the 2 men standing. They did not seem to give a fearful reaction, or any reaction at all in that case. This complex is under investigation for possible drug trafficking by the United States World Police Force. Without a real reaction from the men he addressed, the commander moved in closer. "Hands up," Salter said. Frank had his sights on the young man sitting down on the chair. He seemed the most fearful, the wild guard. The two men gave a put-out look and turned slowly, raising their hands. The one on the left began to speak in English, with a Middle Eastern dialect. "There's no drugs in here," the man said, with a defiant stare at the commander. "Well, that is what we are here to find out," the commander returned triumphantly. He was not swayed by the man's reply. "We make watches in here. No drugs." Suddenly, two more men ran in the room. They halted when they saw the weapons, raising their hands in the air. "Stop right there," the commander said as they halted. Commander Salder filed them into an office room nearby. He peered down another long hallway before shutting the door. He reached for his radio. "Move in. Situation under control." He called the flanks in. The commander started telling their suspects to get on their knees. "How many men are in this complex?" the commander asked the defiant older man, who seemed to do the talking. 250, he answered. As he listened, Matt almost didn't believe the man. If what he said was true, then they were in the middle of a hornet's nest, that they were in grave danger of kicking. The commander spoke into his radio. "This is 52395. We're going to need some help, over." 50199, "Back up en route," responded a voice, sounding more serious. Commander Salder started at Blair. "Okay. We keep them quiet until they get here. No one knows how big this place is. From what I'm hearing, it's a lot bigger than we thought. When they get here, we'll take them in. Then we can check this place out." He was thinking out loud to his men. "Just keep them quiet. Once they know they're going down, they may get hostile." "Yes, sir," Matt responded, without a thought. Within minutes, the other 16 members of the squad arrived. Commander Salder filed in the rest of the squad. After another 10 minutes, 2 other squads arrived. Salder picked up the speaker of the group. He was kneeling on the ground like the rest, their hands on their heads. "You're coming with us. We're going to check this place out." He looked at the other commander. "I'm going to need another squad with me. Frank, Blair, Salo, let's go." The man led them into a hallway. What was left of the 2 squads stayed behind and babysat. This hall was longer, approximately 75 yards. Matt was amazed at the intricacy and the expanse of it all. Commander Salder began lightly interrogating the man who led them as they walked. "So, you build watches here, huh?" he asked, staring forward. "Yes, no drugs. You will see," he said, perturbed. They reached another crossroads. The right side had been closed off. It was a shoddy construction job, the concrete slab hurriedly installed to block off the whole right side fork of the crossroads. "Is there anything on the other side of that wall?" Salder asked their guide. The man glared at Salder. "Cement," he returned matter-of-factly. He opened the door, entering the circular tunnel to their left. An assembly line of workers stood before them, quietly working among the hums of belts and gears. They were assembling wristwatches. The spokesperson stood at the door after he opened it, as if presenting it to them. There was a muttering from workers inside. There was alarm at the presence of the American soldiers. Some of them looked fearful. The squad moved in to secure the area, but no securing was needed. Still, they moved in. "We are not from Argentina, yet the government insists that we pay extra tax on our products. We will not have that. That is why we do in secret." The man looked at his watch. "Now, will you prosecute this? Or can I go on with my day?" The commander was looking around the room. Without looking back, he said, "We haven't checked out anything yet. What's in that office?" "That is my office," the man said, a slight annoyance showing in his voice. "Do you wish to see my orders for watches? Is this not proof enough for you?" he exclaimed, angrily now. "I want to see what's in that office," said Commander Salder, raising his voice. "Very well," said the man. stormed to the office door. He opened the door to what looked like a regular office. The commander followed him, looking up at the ceiling. The guide, who was apparently the leader of the operation, stood aside. Commander Salder sat down at the desk, examined some of the papers. It looked simple enough. They were orders for watches. They were invoices, work orders, some of them from reputable companies. There was nothing here. He sat at the desk, thought. Salder himself was amazed at the complex. The man's business must have been doing well. The place looked like a brand new factory. It was state-of-the-art. There was what looked like air conditioning units hanging from the ceiling. The air temperature was very cool. These were not the working conditions of a sweatshop. There was a good chance that the people working here also lived here. Matt watched this silent scene from outside the door. The commander rose from the chair. "Well, we do not wish to disturb your business," Salder started. "But you will allow us to keep an eye on this. In the case anything is going on here that could endanger the safety of Argentina's citizens, we will perform unannounced inspections. We apologize for our mistake," the commander continued. "However, take into consideration that these measures are for the good of you and all citizens." The commander had walked up to the leader. He had not broken his stare. He was standing, arms folded over his chest, his back against the open door. "Excuse me," said the commander, as he put his hand on the shoulder to move him away from the door. He stepped aside. Matt saw the commander look at the other side of the open door. The commander's eyes slowly went back to the leader. The man uncrossed his arms and looked at his watch as if he was checking the time. Matt watched as he pressed the button, the crown of his watch. The Al-Qaeda insignia was revealed to Salder on the other side of the door. The commander tore down the flag and threw it to the ground. Al-Qaeda was the sworn enemy of the WPF. The organization had managed to stay alive and attract ultra-radicalists. This seemed to be some of them. They were to be confronted with severe prejudice. Matt's heart began to race. The situation became very different very quickly. Salder raised his weapon. Frank aimed his weapon at the leader. There was a moment of confusion. Why would Al-Qaeda be building watches? Were they generating money for the group? There was a lot of information missing. Matt felt a sudden cold sweat. What the hell is going on? Matt thought. "You will not leave here alive," said the leader. Why would he say that? Matt wondered. He did not understand. Commander Salder reacted. "You are under arrest by the United States World Police Force under suspicion of affiliation with the Al-Qaeda organization." The man bowed his head, not breaking his stare, and repeated, "You will not leave here alive." Commander Salder did not know what to do. They had to do something. He pushed something on his watch, Matt explained to the commander. Salder pulled the arm of the man, looked at the watch. He tore it off his wrist and smashed it to the ground, stomping on it. Salder grabbed the man and picked up his radio. He ordered everyone to be ready for an attack. Salder was afraid. He seemed impulsive, upset. They moved out of the office. When they got back to the factory floor, the workers were scrambling. They had been alerted. The squad commander from the WPF squads started yelling. He was telling them to freeze, trying to gain control of the situation. But there was no stopping this. Salder cuffed the leader. He began moving his men to the back of the room. "This is an Al-Qaeda-funded factory," Commander Salder attempted to bring everyone up to speed. "They have been alerted to our presence. Consider everyone we encounter a lethal threat and respond in kind." Suddenly, men entered the room and began firing. The squad took cover, fired back. 50 other men, were abruptly sharing the huge room of the factory floor. The deafening sound of gunfire filled Matt's ears. He realized that he was firing. Suddenly, a woman standing next to him fell. He looked down, horrified to see that the bullet had entered her right eye. There was a puddle of blood and gray matter. "Fall back," shouted the commander. He shouted mayday cries into his radio. "Frank, Blair," he shouted. "We have to get this man out of here." Matt could not break from the woman lying next to him, shot by her own people. At that second, the man who appeared to be the leader began muttering. It was what sounded like a prayer or a chant. It was not a prayer of desperation, but one of confidence. What the fuck? Matt thought. Through a door at the back of the room, more enemy soldiers flooded in. There was a storeroom, barrels with nuclear insignias on them. "What's in those barrels?" shouted Salter. "What's in those barrels?" Salter did not want to start a nuclear reaction. The man in custody would not answer. He was deep in the trance of his prayer. He would not break it. "Is there another way out?" Salter again asked. Suddenly, the man opened his eyes and said again, "You will not leave here alive." Matt was losing his calm. He looked around. It was dark, and there was little he could see. He reached at his left calf and grabbed his flashlight. "Sir," he shouted, "this way." Matt took the lead, lifting their leader to his feet. A door appeared at the other end of the room. They ran towards it. Their unwilling prisoner slowed them. Frank and Salter were basically carrying him. They came to a crossroads. Matt had them turn left. They could hear shouting behind them. Soldiers were closing in. Their pace quickened. They sprinted as quickly as they could, carrying their prisoner. "There's a doorway at the end of this tunnel. Run," said Matt. The beat of his sprint was evident in his words. This door was different from all the other doors. It looked like a door you would see in an old house. It had a brass door handle, rectangle, old-style markings. Matt barely stopped himself before running into the door. He opened it with speed, stared in horror. The other side of the door was blocked off by plywood. Matt's face contorted. He listened behind him. The two others and the prisoner caught up as he shoved the plywood blockade. Matt looked around. There was no other way out. The door was solid, but Matt's intuition told him that it would move. He shoved harder, punched. Frank arrived, did the same. Whatever they were pushing at behind the blockade was firmly seated on the ground, but began giving at the top. Matt and Frank began pounding at the top. It gave a little more, then a little more. It was opening. What luck, Matt thought. He heard a crashing. The blockade became lighter as it fell. They ran into the new room. Matt stared in awe of a new realization. It was the basement of a house. The door makes sense. It's a house door, Matt thought. Suddenly, there was gunfire right behind them. Frank ran for cover in the basement. Matt turned, saw Salter call for help with the prisoner. Matt stepped back inside the door to answer the call of the commander. Commander Salter was on his knees, trying to lift the man. Matt helped him with the load. The commander fired shots behind them. As they entered the new room, gunshots getting louder, there was a tensing, a release, and then dead weight. Their prisoner was dead, shot multiple times. The commander cried out. He was shot as well. Their prisoner fell to the ground between them. Matt stepped over to the commander. "Commander," he said in a loud and raspy voice, "are you okay?" "Yeah," came the commander's answer in a voice using no breath. Frank was behind them, firing shots at the approaching threat. At the order of the commander, Matt joined him. They fired continuously and watched as men fell. "There is a staircase behind us," Matt yelled, not moving his eyes from his targets. "We have to get Commander Salter out of here." Frank gave Matt a nod. They ran to the commander, put one of his arms over each of their shoulders. He stumbled, trying to support himself between them. The other man lay still on the floor. They started up the stairs. Suddenly, there was a huge blast that shook the old staircase. Frank and Blair stumbled and fell with the commander between them, face first. "What the fuck was that?" shouted Frank. They started up the stairs again. Shots were being fired from inside the room now. They rushed up the stairs to find an old would-be condemned house. The ground was shaking beneath them. At the top of the stairs, Matt glanced right and then left. To his left was a screen door, closed but not latched, with an outer door hanging off the hinges. Frank saw it too. The commander had a red string of blood dangling from his mouth. His eyes were half opened. They rushed out the door, hearing footsteps coming up the stairs. Their pursuers were close. Before them lay a porch and a vast green yard. There was a tree line 30 yards ahead. They made for it. Once in the yard, they heard more shots. They were even closer than before. They ran, dragging the commander's feet. Once they were 10 yards from the tree line, a shot hit the man in the middle, their commander. They were running at such a pace that Frank and the commander fell. Matt turned to see a swarm of attackers. He drew his weapon and fired a spray of shots. Suddenly, there were sharp piercing pains in Matt's abdomen. Then there was another, and another, and another. Then one in his chest. The world went into slow motion. Matt fell to his butt in a sitting position. The attackers chasing them were now pouring off the porch. There were so many. He felt another shot hit near his shoulder. As he began falling backwards, he witnessed the house before him explode. It was as if a volcano were beneath it. The roof shot up in the air, coming down in pieces, aflame. Men went flying off of the porch, pieces of them landing all over the yard. Matt felt. It surprised him. It wasn't the pain or the impending end that he felt. It was pure feeling. He felt deeply saddened. My life is over, he thought. He didn't expect to die like this. He hadn't seen action in all his time in the U.S. WPF, and now this. The decision to get him away from his life, held together by the adhesive of a girl he loved, led him here. He remembered the downward spiral he had to remove himself from. He was broken. Matt was here to fix himself. He missed her, though. He was angry with her for so long. All his thoughts, while he was serving, were about her and what she had done to end the relationship. And in this moment of clarity, he saw that it was him. He thought of the day he left. After countless promises, rehab visits, depressions, it was clear. It was he who left her. Just when she needed him the most, he was lost in confusion. He didn't know where he wanted to go in life. He woke up one day and decided he had to leave. He remembered the pain he felt, the guilt. He walked into her apartment he had forced her to get to move on with her life. Her family had split up, in part because of him. He knew her pain. Matt found she was doing cocaine again. He was crushed. He barely slept. He woke early, in tears. At that moment, he knew what he had to do. He walked in, leaving the door open, quietly sobbing. There she was, washing dishes. Her back was to him. She did not hear him enter. She was as beautiful as ever. Her shape was silhouetted by the sunlight entering the window over the kitchen sink. He paused and looked at the living room and the couch they so often spooned on. Countless nights they had watched movies when being alone wouldn't do. Then she turned. "Hey, honey," she said. Stephanie was totally happy, concealing her habits from Matt. At the time, this reinforced that he had to leave. Matt didn't reply. Quickly, she was concerned. "Honey," she said. She walked to him, looking at the beauty of her face, made him sob aloud. She hugged him. For a brief second, he was lost in her warm embrace. He forgot everything, including the sadness of the moment. "I have to go," he said in a pitch, raised by his tears, which would not cease. "I have to go, Steph. I can't stay here with you anymore." It was sort of a mumble, because of the crying consuming his mouth and lips. She suddenly broke off the embrace and stared at him. The break felt to him like a sudden emergence into freezing waters. "I found it, Steph," he said with empathy. "Your Coke. I can't do this." He couldn't tell how she was feeling. Her face was stone. Then she frowned and cried. She reached for him, and by some will he did not know of, Matt pushed her away. He sobbed again, but quickly regained his composure. "Here is $500 from my share of the rent," he said. "I'm sorry. Goodbye." He walked towards the door, still open. "Matt, please," she exclaimed. "I'll go back to rehab. Please, Matt." Matt didn't stop. The girl he wanted to save, to make smile, was now the girl he was leaving. He failed. This thought brought Matt to anger. The one he loved more than anything else in life, he left behind. He left her worse than when he found her. He failed. The crusade he had started to save his love had failed. He despised himself. Matt made up his mind that morning to leave. It was as easy as flipping a switch. He had no will to do anything else. He was spent in life, and so by the end of the week, he was at boot camp. And now, nearly 3 years later, he lay dying after following the path of anger. Matt's back finally crashed onto the rough grass as these thoughts ran through his mind. Desolation filled his heart. He would never see her again. He would never see his sister, or his mother, or his father, or his room. He was 22, and at the end of a short life, he was dead. Matt had made nothing of his life. Now his death would cause his family pain, and he would leave this world with only pain in his mind. He turned and looked at the commander and the private laying on the ground. Matt was almost on top of them. He looked at his hand. He was clenching his gun. He rested his head back on the grass, waited for death to steal the rest of his haloed, blurred vision. He stared up at the sky, wished he could see the stars one more time. There was so much feeling. A face appeared in his distorted vision. Slow motion. The face was looking down on Matt. He was coming to check on his kill. Matt felt anger. As a reflex, he extended his arm and fired a shot at point-blank range to the man's head. The gun fired, and Matt felt another piercing in his gut. The pain was far away now, and truly, he did not care. He continued fighting for his last moment with his sky. The undertow of consciousness pulled with all its might. Matt was fighting with all the will he had. As the undertow took his consciousness, he let go and expected never to wake again. Matt did wake, though. He never wanted to experience action again. He left the WPF, honorably discharged. He went home to heal from 7 gunshot rounds to the abdomen and chest. The close range damaged some of his large intestine. He was lucky to have survived. After countless surgeries and being sedated for the pain, he didn't even wake up until a week later. Then, he went home with the sadness that was awakened in him at the moment of his near death. Matt knew that the old man in the gas station would never be able to compete with that story. Matt retired from his memories. He was tired, and again, ready to move on. He was tired of that feeling. He just needed to do it now. Just make the choice. Just leave it. Maybe that is another reason he admired the old man. He had moved on. He was content. Maybe there were no answers. He had become reclusive, not returning the calls of old friends who heard he was home. Even Frank called. He did not call back, though. Over the past 6 months, he would go through periods of not leaving his room for weeks. He didn't want to see Frank, or anyone. He didn't take any visitors. It was all he could do to escape the nightmares at first. At times, he didn't know if he was losing touch. He searched, but there was no answer. The clock read 1:35 as he stopped at a red light. Beside him, pulled up a carload of girls blaring loud music. He looked over, and they all waved flirtatiously. He laughed and realized he was free. He waved awkwardly and pulled through the green light. "Well, Matt, what do you do now?" Then, it hit him like a bolt of lightning, out of the blue. It was a crazy idea, but perfect. An epiphany. His uncle had taken him and Ames on a trip when they were kids to Wyoming. Matt had some of the best memories with his sister in his life on that trip. He couldn't put his finger on why, but he was now suddenly drawn to this place. It was a way to go back to the beginning, to his earliest, happiest memories. A tether to a time when he could be anything. The future had not yet been written. The thought put a smile on his face. He had saved money while in the service. A spontaneous thought arrived. He would spend a week in Wyoming, just looking at the mountains and the stars. He would get to see the stars once more, just like he wished when he was dying out there on that field in Argentina. It was the beginning of August, and he would make it just in time for the dog days of summer. He had to leave as soon as possible. With that, Matt went home and went to bed. He still was without answers to many of the questions that lingered in his past. He found something, though, a new sense of hope. This sense filled his face with a smile and his eyes with light. he could finally belong to a life free enough to move on and on. He would start again tomorrow. The hunter walked down the long corridor towards his destination. It was just like any other fucking briefing, he thought. He turned his head to the rising and falling of the mortar lines on the painted brick wall. The life of a WPF hero had worn on him. He had never taken any time for reflection. No time to think about the lives he'd taken or the family he'd essentially abandoned. Each time these thoughts even came close, he pushed them back. It was a mechanism he developed. Control your thoughts. Don't become a victim of your own head. He had seen plenty of guys lose their heads over the years. He knew it was all because they took this first step. They lost control of their thoughts. For many years, it was media hype and interviews on the right-wing media streams. They loved the terrorist hunter. This among his other nicknames. He had played the role, a rock star WPF military man who had stopped the bad guys dead in their tracks. He loved it for so long, and hey, even now. He had just finished up an interview this morning on his latest mission. The interviewers were in awe of him. They were always so complimentary. They had made his task force, the Silver Eagle, synonymous with American nationalism. The type of nationalism that sparked fear in the hearts of America haters all over the world. That is, unless he got one of those liberal plants who wanted to paint him into a corner and make him look like an insane savage out for blood. Like he had no sense of morals, only America forever. Just a tool of the administration, out for political gain and good optics for their agenda. The lieutenant colonel had no time for politics, however. He had become his taskmaster, driving him mission after mission. He was certain that this briefing would bring the seeds of a new assignment. The lieutenant colonel was a hard and fast superior, demanding and never accepting excuses. As he approached his office, he thought to himself that he always respected his superior's orders. But there was something that he didn't trust in this case. The lieutenant colonel seemed above politics, but anyone who moved forward with this much certainty and sure-footedness had to have an agenda. The office door was open for him, and he entered to see the lieutenant colonel sitting at his desk, studying a file. As a good soldier, he saluted until ordered otherwise, standing with perfect posture, hand at his brow. The lieutenant colonel looked to him, side-eyed, to the corner of his eye. At ease. He quickly snapped his hand to his side. The usual banter took place. Details of the latest mission were discussed in grave detail, but his attention was drawn elsewhere. The part of his mind, the mechanism that fought back the thoughts he had won against taking over, were putting up a fight today. And its timing of this loss of control was terrible. When he was younger, he had suffered from this type of loss of control of his thoughts and feelings. But at this point, he had mastered it, or so he thought. It was like he was having a memory, but it wasn't a memory, where one would see pictures and images and react like an audience watching. This was not like that. These thoughts were like someone injecting a syringe into his arm with a drug of a feeling of a certain memory. The pictures and images were just for context. This was potent and hard to ignore. He couldn't help but follow the feeling. The picture was only that of an old bedroom he had when he was a kid. But it wasn't the picture that impacted him. It was the feeling that he had in that time. It was hard to put words on, but it was the feeling of a certain sense of peace he had in that old room. He followed the feeling down and found tangible thoughts. He had just beaten the tar out of one of his brothers. He lost his temper and just went off. As he waited for his father to get home, he was overcome with fear. In a moment of panic, his logic took over. He promised himself he would never be the aggressor again in a fight like this. It didn't matter if his daddy beat the tar out of him in this case or not, because he had already learned his lesson. He would take his punishment like a man and never lash out that way again. Wisdom would win. The visual that provided this emotional context was only him sitting on his bunk bed, awaiting the opening of the door, revealing his father's wrath. As the belt swung against his backside, he could not feel it. He was lost in his feeling of triumph, deciding he would never be part of this type of violence again. He would rise above it, and would rather be a victim of it than the perpetrator. He would be a permanent messenger of peace. The feeling raised him to a higher level of peace of mind than he had ever experienced, and honestly, a higher level experienced by many who seek it. As he followed the thought further and further, at this point, it would usually make him laugh, and then he realized, at this point, he had had the same thought, the memory replaying on a daily basis. It was such a part of him, day to day, that he could no longer recognize it. Every day, as he dressed, putting on his day-to-day greens, he played this scene in his head. The fact he was playing it now was simply an anomaly, out of place. But this meant that he could not ignore it. It was not as commonplace as the paint he saw every day on the brick walls down the long hall. It exaggerated the feelings, and he could not shake it. He couldn't shut down the memory. He couldn't shut down the feeling. Something was changing in him, right before his mind, right now. As the lieutenant colonel pointed to a map that had suddenly appeared on the wall behind him, he went on with his oration. This type of technology is small and has been identified as both highly destructive and highly untraceable. As he listened, he fought his battle with the undeniable feeling. Of course, he had not taken the path of peace. As a matter of fact, that lie he had told himself that day never even partially came true. He was violent by nature and could never see himself as anything but a military man, a killer. Killing weighed on his consciousness sometimes, of course. He was not a psychopath. That sense of peace just wasn't part of him, except for that day. Then, it mysteriously vanished. Suppressed, repressed, whatever the word. And his father unleashed violence upon him. His sins against his brother were paid for. Yet the memory of this aided his subconscious each and every day, just below the surface. And now that it had surfaced out of place, he was able to identify this. Is there a problem, Major? He was sweating now. It was showing that he was having trouble being in the room, mindful of what the lieutenant colonel was saying. No, sir. Then get your head in the game, he yelled. The lieutenant colonel paused for effect and then went on. You and the Eagle are going to take out Abudia. All the intel points to him. The briefing finished. It was more than he thought. The whole next mission was planned and assigned. That was that. The haul went by much faster this time. He walked out of the base and got into his car. He pulled a cigarette from his pack, put it up to his lips, and then pulled it back out, holding it in his hand. He sighed. He suddenly didn't want to go. He had betrayed something in himself long ago, and now was suddenly aware of it. He was done with these missions. He was confused and tired by the thought. He wanted that feeling of peace that he committed to when he was 7 years old. He wanted to talk to his wife. He wanted to tell her how he felt, just like he did when they were young and in love. But that was many years ago. He picked up the phone and dialed. It rang and rang and rang. Voicemail. He hung up without leaving a message. But she called back almost immediately. "Hello?" he answered. "Wow," an upset voice said on the other end. "Thanks for calling." There was a sense of sarcasm in her voice. "Hi," he said. "How are you?" "Are you kidding me?" Now it was anger. "You've been back for 3 days, and you couldn't even call to tell us you're alive?" The words would not come. "Well, great. Good to hear from you, Major." There was an awkward pause. "I ship out again tomorrow," he said. "Well, that's great. Thanks for keeping me updated." "I'm thinking about refusing the mission," he said. There was an exasperated laugh on the other end. "What are you talking about?" she asked. I don't want to do this anymore." To her, it must have sounded like he was crazy. "What are you saying?" she asked, tears now in her voice. It was really awkward. She had never heard him talk like this. She had never heard him express doubt or indecisiveness. Doing it over the phone certainly wouldn't make any sense to her. "Well," she tried to pull the call together, "don't get yourself killed, okay?" She sniffed. He did not reply. She hung up. Stay tuned next week for Chapter 3, Freedom. This has been an audio presentation of The Landscape of the Heart. Copyright 2020 by R.P. Watts. Please subscribe to this feed.